Hey everyone, and welcome back to our To Be Like Christ Bible study of the Gospel of Luke. We're in chapter 6, verse 6 today. There's 24 chapters in Luke, so we're about a quarter of the way through. It's a long book, longest book in the New Testament, if I remember correctly. So we're making pretty good progress. In the last video, it was the Sabbath day, and Jesus' disciples were accused of breaking the Sabbath, remember, for picking grain in the field. And Jesus addressed that and dismissed that. But now it's another Sabbath day, and the Pharisees and the scribes are after Jesus again. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's read verses 6 through 11 of chapter 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. And so, as we mentioned, it's another Sabbath day here. There's probably more rules about what a person could and couldn't do on Sabbath than compared to the other days of the week. So they probably thought this was prime time to catch Jesus doing something wrong. They're back for another attempt after their embarrassment on the last Sabbath. This time they're in the synagogue, which is kind of the center of Jewish community outside of Jerusalem. And there's a man in the synagogue, a Jew, fellow Jew, that has a withered hand. Probably some kind of paralysis or deformity or something like that. And I want you to notice where the focus of the Pharisees and scribes is here. Their focus is not on perhaps helping a handicapped man to his seat or carrying something, or maybe just encouraging him because maybe he had a bad week, and it's hard to be somebody who's disabled in a world of mostly abled people. And so they're not into doing anything constructive to help this man. Instead, all of their attention and their energy is focused on catching Jesus doing something wrong. And I thought there's a good application here for us and for modern Christians. And that is that, well, both Christians and non-Christians, I guess, can fall into the same error, but sometimes we are really, really zealous at catching and calling out doctrine breakers or rule breakers, or looking down on somebody and seeing that they're not doing something quite right and calling them out. Some people that really get their kicks off of doing that. And I think it gives them it's a pride thing. Right? It gives them a sense of superiority, maybe self-righteousness. And they spend all their time kind of trying to catch people doing wrong things so that they can correct them, and hardly any time helping those who are in need, either physically in need or spiritually in need. Sometimes we can spend all of our time focusing on what people are doing wrong and not doing anything right, or to make things right. Too many people are quick to call out bad doctrine, but very slow to extend a helping hand to the needy. And again, I think it's an issue of pride. You can boost your own ego by calling out the wrongs of other people, but you have to humble yourself to be a servant to someone who's below you, or somebody who's humble yourself to do the job of a servant. That's probably a better way to say that. That's a humbling experience, and humbling ourselves is a lot more difficult than believing that we're self-righteous. As we mentioned, on a previous Saturday, Jesus had taught the Pharisees what they were getting wrong about the law. The Sabbath day was intended for the good of man, and the laws of the Sabbath were to be interpreted accordingly. And here, they were trying to form an accusation against Jesus based on him doing good to a man on the Sabbath day. That's why he challenges them, right? He says, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? He's basically asking them the same question that he already answered in the last Sabbath. And based on their actions, what do we realize? We realize that they get an F- on their comprehension test from the last lesson, from verses 1 through 6. They did not get it. And Jesus was again here highlighting the fact that these men did not understand God's heart in giving the old law, or God's intentions behind it. A lot of what they thought they knew was based on their traditions, and it was not a comprehension of God's a proper comprehension of God's will in those instructions. Jesus knew the evil intentions that were residing in the Pharisees and scribes' hearts, and he challenged them. He challenged them very boldly out in public, in the middle of the synagogue. He called the man with the withered hand to him, and then he spoke to the assembly that had gathered there in the synagogue that day. And keep in mind, the synagogue was probably home turf for the Pharisees and the scribes. It was full of people who were religiously minded, who had gathered there on Sabbath. And who do you think that they looked up to when it came to religious things? The common people. They probably look up to the Pharisees and the scribes because they were supposedly the religious scholars. And so that was a place, that was home field. And Jesus walks into their home field and he challenges them in front of all of these people who would have known them. And he calls out their character. So watch. Jesus says in front of everybody, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? Now in Matthew's account, there's a little bit more to this dialogue than what Luke records for us. Jesus spoke about the willingness of the Pharisees and the scribes to pull one of their animals out of the ditch on the Sabbath day. They valued their animals enough to believe that saving them from a ditch or from a sticky situation on the Sabbath day, that was worthy of an exception to the Sabbath work law. Right? But notice the problem with that and why Jesus brings that up is because their actions revealed that they ascribed less value to the handicapped man than they did to their own animals, because they weren't about to give Jesus an exception for healing this man on the Sabbath day, right? Animals versus humans. They're like, oh yeah, sure, go ahead, get your cow out of the ditch, we'll let it slide. But oh, heaven forbid you heal a handicapped man and help him to get out of the metaphorical ditch that he's been in a long time. Oh no, we're not going to accept that. So Jesus was exposing their misaligned priorities in front of the whole Jewish community. This was kind of a brutal, savage takedown by Jesus. When you talk about Jesus being like the lowly, gentle, always kind and loving, tolerant Savior that a lot of our culture has kind of made him out to be, I mean, this is a savage is the only word that comes to mind. This is him just pulling these guys out in front of their whole community and saying, you all are a bunch of hypocrites. This is why in verse 11, the Pharisees and the scribes are so mad. It says that they were, what does it say specifically? They were filled with fury. That wasn't just a little peeved. They were filled with fury. And this is why. They'd just been totally embarrassed by Jesus. Jesus put the ugliness of the Pharisees and the scribes on display for all of their parishioners to see. And he really made them look foolish. And if there's anything that angers a prideful person, it's being embarrassed in front of the people whose respect you crave so much. Right? That's what Jesus did, and then he healed the man in front of everybody. I thought of another application for us there. That is that think about how you would respond if you were in the Pharisee situation. How do you respond when somebody calls out a corruption in your heart, calls out something that's that's out of place, that's misaligned with the way that God would want it to be in your life, what's your first response? The Pharisees' response to Jesus was, we're going to destroy this guy. He's attacked us, he's embarrassed us, he's exposed us. We will destroy him to protect and to preserve and to keep on doing the corruption that's in our hearts. That's one response. And that's a pretty natural response, because when somebody attacks us and embarrasses us and maybe exposes us, being defensive is easy. So we can either destroy the person who exposed us, or the better response, the response of the humble man, is to destroy the sin that has been exposed. To be able to be honest about who we are, about things that we need to change, and say, you know what? Maybe I don't like that guy who just exposed me, but he's right. And I need to be about killing the sin in my own heart and not decimating the character of somebody just because they hurt my pride a little bit. And you begin to see, just in the discussions that we've had today, how pride is so pervasive in these sins. And I think you can probably begin to realize that this is also present in a lot of other sins. It doesn't matter really what sin you may struggle with. A lot of times it's pride that keeps you from getting out of that sin. And so pride is at the roots of a lot of problems. And I think that's why God speaks so harshly against it. That God hates the proud man, the proud look. Because pride keeps us from realizing who we are. And that's sinners that need the grace of God. That's weak human beings who are the creation of somebody else, who are only alive and sustained because God keeps us alive and sustained. Pride will keep us from recognizing our real place in the universe, and that's why it's so dangerous. All right, moving on. I just had one other application, and then we'll kind of close out the story. Compare yourselves to the Pharisees and the scribes. I know that that's hard, but again, the more we read about them, and the more I've read about them, the more I've begun to see that, wow, the problems that we struggle with in the 21st century are the same problems that the Pharisees and the scribes were struggling with all these years ago. You know, their culture was different, their background was different, but at the roots of it, it's so similar. So compare yourselves to them for just a moment. The Pharisees, they had just witnessed miraculous power from God. Right? They saw a handicapped man healed. And how did they respond? Well, they turned the other direction and they said, we're going to destroy Jesus. We're not going to follow him. And we might look at them and think, how stupid. How stupid is that? Who's dumb enough to look at a miracle and to walk away? They had just observed God's power, but all that they were concerned about was what that display of power was going to do to their own power and their own influence. They were desperate to hold on to their name and the reputation that they had and the authority among the community that they had, and desperate to hold on to that pride, and anything that threatened that needed to be removed. That's why Jesus was such a threat. He walks in, embarrasses them, performs miracles, and who do you think the people are going to start looking up to at that point? So rather than accepting Jesus, they plotted to get rid of him. And again, it's easy to be really harsh on the Pharisees for this response, but wasn't their dilemma really the dilemma that we're still struggling with today, a lot of people? Same dilemma that keeps us from acknowledging Jesus as our Lord. The willingness to accept our unimportance in light of God's importance. The willingness to give up our authority and to realize that there is someone who's far greater who's running the show than us. We as human beings like to think that we're at least in charge of our own lives, but that's so wrong. The Pharisees had verifiable evidence right in front of their faces, and they still chose the opposite direction. And my question is, are we doing the same thing? Are you doing the same thing today? Is your resistance to Jesus as Lord a result of the same problem? What is the root of most people's refusal to come to Christ? Well, maybe it's that they haven't seen enough evidence. Right? Maybe they've done scholarly, exhaustive studies of apologetics and science and all of the psychology and philosophy and all these different fields, and they're like, I've been studying and studying, but I just don't have enough evidence to believe that Jesus is the Christ. I'm trying to be unbiased and evaluate all the evidence, but I'm just not there yet. Is that what keeps most people from coming to Jesus and submitting to him? I don't think so. Because if you talk to people out on the street who aren't Christians, most of them can't give you their dissertation on why they believe the evidence for Jesus just isn't strong enough. Right? That's just not why people refuse Jesus as their Lord. And that's not why the Pharisees rejected Jesus as their Lord. It wasn't a lack of evidence. I mean, it was right in front of their faces. The question is your reason, or most people's reason for rejecting Jesus, is it really at the bottom more of a hesitation to relinquish sovereignty over our own lives? To stop believing in our own self-importance? Is it because we don't want to humble ourselves? Is it because we like the notoriety that surrounds our name, and we like the way that people look at us, and we don't want to relinquish that and to become a servant of God, to direct all of the attention to him? That was the Pharisees' problem, and I think honestly that's most people's problem today. Not a lack of evidence, but an unwillingness to give up personal sovereignty. We want to decide the direction of our lives, what we support, what we don't support, the causes we stand up for and the ones that we don't. We want a say in, at least we want to believe that we're in charge. And that makes Christ really unappealing to a lot of people. Because he's saying, no, this is my world. It runs the way that I want. The morality of this world is based off of my nature, off of my character, and I'm calling you to join me and serve me. But that's going to mean submission. That's going to mean changing your life. That's going to mean maybe even doing some things that you're not too fond of, because I'm going to tell you that they need to be done. There's going to be some transformation in your life that isn't going to be comfortable. It's not going to be looked on kindly by the world, right? But the reality is, and all the evidence points to the fact that I, God, am the sovereign. And that to not submit to me is a really bad idea. People don't like submission and humility, especially in an individualistic culture like ours. And I think that that's probably the reason that more people reject Christ rather than a lack of evidence. And that's what we see here. At the end of the day, though, human sovereignty is an illusion, a complete illusion. It's something we've made up on our own. We either serve God willingly or we serve him unwillingly. We either serve God and accomplish his will intentionally and with his assistance, or God just uses us somehow, some way to do what he was going to do anyway. And what I mean by that is, you look at people who so strongly resisted God. They did their absolute best to fight against God. People like Pilate, Judas, who betrayed Jesus, Nebuchadnezzar, who was so prideful. I thought he was just the greatest. And what, all of these people, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, resisted God, said, no, I am greater than any Hebrew, any Jewish God, any Yahweh, any Jehovah out there. I'm greater than that. I am a king. And God used all those men to accomplish his intentions. None of those men for half a second stopped God's intentions from becoming reality and from coming to fruition. In fact, they all played a part, many of them unknowingly and quite unwillingly, but they still played a part. Humans aren't sovereign over anything. And even when we think we're fighting the sovereign, we're not being successful. So the Bible tells us that we're in a time period now where there's an invitation that's been sent out. There's an invitation to become a part of God's kingdom. This kingdom that's never going to be destroyed, that's going to outlast all other kingdoms. We've been invited in to become a citizen of that, to become an ally of God. And in the end, we know that God is going to conquer all, that everyone's response in the end is going to be the same. Everyone's going to bow the knee to God. Everyone's going to confess that Jesus is the King, that he's won this thing and that he's been winning all along, whether we saw it or not. And when Jesus returns in his kingdom, how we meet him it's everything. We either meet him as an ally, and he praises us and gives us his grace and glorifies us for being faithful servants, or we meet him as an enemy, as an adversary, and the only thing that awaits us at that point is justice and judgment for fighting against the sovereign and the Creator. Right now, the invitation is out. The options are on the table. Which will you choose? And when churches offer the invitation at the end of sermons and stuff like that, this is the offer, right? To join God's side, to participate with Christ in the image of his death, burial, and resurrection. You know, we talk about baptism and dying to our old selves, being immersed in water, raising up to new life, like Jesus described the new birth in John chapter 3. Going through that process and becoming a new creation for a new kingdom and being a citizen of God's kingdom, the right winning side that no one's going to fight against. That's the invitation. But there's going to come a time when that invitation is no longer open, and the opportunity for citizenship is no longer open, and we're either going to be in or out, and whether we're in or out, that's our eternity. So don't resist that invitation because you have bought into some lie that you're in charge. You know, from the beginning, you look at, I'm off my notes at this point. You look at Adam and Eve. What is the temptation of the serpent to Adam and Eve? That you can be like God. Right? Isn't that what many people believe? Isn't that what they really desire? I get to call the shots. I'm the one who runs this thing. I decide what right and wrong is. I want to be like God so I can kick him out and run things the way that I like. That's the temptation of Satan from the very beginning. And God's message to the people, to Adam and Eve, who chose that route, was that you are not you are not God. And buying into that lie separates you from the one who created you. And when we do that, and we all do that, we all buy the lie, we need to be reconciled again to God. And it's through Jesus that reconciliation happens. So that was the offer that Jesus was putting on the table. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they were still biting the fruit off in the garden and saying, this is what I really want. that fruit has never been true. It's always been a lie. All right, I'm done. It's like 10 o'clock. Time for bed. Time to edit this video and then to go to bed. So my camera might have stopped recording like 20 minutes ago. I have no idea, but I hope you guys have a good, it's Monday. So if you're watching this on a Monday, I hope you have a good Monday or whatever day it is. Have a good day. See you tomorrow.